The Medical Device Directive, which is currently the legislation that governs this space, defines the requirement for a CE mark for any product that shares digital patient images for any diagnostic purpose. So if you're doing that, if you're using an image for a diagnostic purpose, you need to be CE marked. Now, there is some debate as to what constitutes diagnostic work, but that has actually been largely resolved by the Royal College of Radiologists when it relates to medical imaging. And they split it into two categories: primary diagnostic work, which is where you've created a formal report. So that's the sort of thing I would do as a radiologist. And then clinical review work, which is actually more for things like MDTs, case discussions, anything where you're looking at a patient's imaging to make a decision or that could impact their management. That still constitutes diagnostic work. Now, the problem we have here is that images that are being shared on communication platforms, such as WhatsApp, if you're a junior clinician and you're asking a senior colleague, here's a picture of an X-ray, what do you think? You are by definition asking them for diagnostic input to help alter the management of that patient. And therefore you are using it in a CE mark requirement. Now, the problem for you as an individual of not using a CE mark product is you're essentially using what should be a medical device in an off-license capacity. And that means that you're responsible for the decisions that you make using that device. And not only that, but also your employing trust are also responsible for the use of that product. And this is where we are really trying to champion the issue, and we have the answer in Bleepa.
I think the main risk is that if you're using something which not received appropriate regulatory approval, then you open yourself up to greater significant legal and regulatory risk of your own, whether that be enforcement action by the ICO or other forms of claims. It can exacerbate the liability that you're potentially exposed to, and the reason being is that it's potentially a sort of aggravating factor in any sort of anything that goes wrong in using it, I suppose. So if data were to be lost, for example, or if there was suggestion in a clinical negligence claim that inappropriate information was shared and didn't get the right diagnosis, whatever it may be, the fact that you've used a non-regulated piece of software in support of diagnostic decisions could be an additional risk for you. And the reason why it's important is because any software which in effect provides kind of diagnostic support, acts as a sort of diagnostic tool, which this could be if you're using it as a means by which to get information to clinicians and get them to provide a diagnosis, etc. And that's regulated as a medical device and therefore has to meet the relevant standards set by the MHRA. I think from a GDPR perspective, the headline reason for being a concern for trusts in particular is that if you use a platform to process data on your behalf, then they're arguably doing so in their capacity as a processor, and for which the trust is a controller and retains overall responsibility for ensuring that data is used lawfully, securely, and complying with the GDPR more generally. So I think that's the type of scenario we're talking about here, where you've got trusts that know that there's widespread use of WhatsApp as a means to communicate between clinicians. So I think it opens them up to potential legal liabilities and responsibilities. And the key concerns in that respect, as a headline, in terms of headlines, I think would be, firstly, security. So there's no opportunity really to carry out any due diligence on WhatsApp to determine whether or not it's a secure messaging platform for the purposes of clinical communications. And indeed, it wasn't built for the purpose. So it professes on the face of it to be end-to-end encrypted, but it's not being used for the purpose realistically it was originally designed. And there's no realistic way to carry out any form of due diligence on that, because WhatsApp are not going to engage with hundreds of different NHS trusts, for example, around whether or not their platform works for their particular purposes. The second, so I suppose just to finish that point, if there is any loss of data as a result of using WhatsApp, then I think the trust is in the firing line for any responsibility or liability that flows from it, particularly where it was aware that its clinicians were using it. Relatedly, there's a requirement under the GDPR where you are a controller and using a processor on your behalf to have appropriate contractual provisions in place. The likelihood of getting that in WhatsApp, I would say, is negligible to none whatsoever. So you're operating in a way that doesn't have a mandatory contractual governance framework in place. There are a number of data subject rights, including a right to access all the personal data held, for example, by a controller. If that's not all held on one system, then on the face of it, the trust is unable to give full effect to those patients' rights, because they may, well, as a controller of that, they need to have access to it in order to give them a full copy of all personal data held about them. So I'd say those are the kind of the key GDPR issues from a day-to-day compliance perspective. One of the key issues with WhatsApp, as I see it, is that it's not integrated into the patient record system, and photographs, for example, are downloaded onto an individual user's phone. So, that's clearly not very secure. The fact that their privacy settings are changing and allowing for the onward flow of data to other organizations potentially means you have a loss of control over it. So in effect, you don't realistically know where that data is going to end up potentially. So that further exacerbates the risk to trust as controllers and custodians of the data overall.
Our frontline staff are so digitally enabled now, they expect to be working in a mobile way. The pager is dead. They're really keen to embed it in their workflows to make life easy. And I think we have to support that. I mean, the fact that doctors are using WhatsApp suggests that's a workaround, and we need to find a more robust solution. And also the other thing to say is that all of this patient-related information is not being captured, or a large percentage of it is not being captured, yet it's a core to what we're doing. So that's really, really key as well.
I would also highlight, as a clinician, this isn't purely about regulatory compliance and liability. Fundamentally, this is a patient safety issue. If you're being asked to give an opinion on a patient's image, a patient who you may not have seen, to a junior colleague, you want to be using imaging of the right quality. Otherwise, it's just not safe. The example that I give, and the thing that always used to panic me slightly as a radiologist, are pediatric fractures. Say a pediatric patient comes into A&E with a very subtle hairline fracture. The ANP or the junior doctor in A&E aren't sure if that fracture is there or not. They then send the photo through to the orthopedic registrar, who says, "Oh no, I don't think there's anything there, we'll send them home." Then the child subsequently goes on to have a compound fracture where the bone dislodges and comes out through the side of the leg. Now, in that scenario, the clinician who gave a view on that is liable for that decision, but they've made that decision off poor substandard imaging using a platform that wasn't appropriate. And there is a requirement on trusts as their employer to provide them with appropriate equipment to conduct their clinical work. And therefore, we would strongly make the case that actually they should be using a platform like Bleepa for that.
You are required to maintain personal data in a manner that is accurate. And alongside that, you have a requirement under CQC regulations to ensure that you have an entire contemporaneous record of the patient's care. So I'm not sure how it would be seen by the ICO or a court, for example, but there's an argument that I can see is that if you've got significant chunks of a patient's care that's being dealt with outside of the core clinical record, to what extent is the data you're processing accurate? Because there may well be significant diagnostic decisions that are not covered in the patient record, for example. So I think that's a clear area of concern as well.